There is no franchise in the first quarter of the 21st century that has experienced more extreme swings from rock bottom to the absolute pinnacle than the Chicago Blackhawks. We're talking about a team that was called the worst franchise in all of professional sports in 2004, not just hockey, all of sports, and then turned around and built one of the most dominant playoff dynasties the NHL has seen in decades. And then, somehow, after tearing it all apart, descended right back into the darkness again. Nobody does it quite like Chicago. Today, we're ranking the 3 worst and 3 best Blackhawks teams from 2001 to 2025. And if history has anything to say about it, there might be a reason to feel good about what's coming. Chicago Blackhawks. 6 Stanley Cups. And some of the most painful years in NHL history. This is the full picture. Before we get into the rankings, it's worth understanding why this franchise swings so wildly between the best and the worst. The Blackhawks have a history of going all in drafting right, developing right, winning right, and then watching it collapse when age, salary cap pressure, and roster mismanagement catch up all at once. We've seen it happen twice now in the span of about 20 years. And both times, it started with a whole lot of losing. Let's start at the bottom. The 2003-4 Blackhawks, coming in at number 3 on the worst list. The 2003-4 Chicago Blackhawks. Now, a lot of Blackhawks fans today think of the early 2020s as the franchise's lowest modern moment. And they're not wrong, we'll get to that. But this group was genuinely awful too, and they deserve their place on this list. 59 points, that was the total. 59 points in an 82-game season, good for one of the worst records in the entire league, and the context makes it even grimmer. This was a franchise still being run under then-owner Bill Wirtz, derisively nicknamed Dollar Bill by the fan base, a man who refused to allow home games to be televised in the Chicago market, claiming it was unfair to season ticket holders. Think about that for a second. The Blackhawks were playing in one of the biggest cities in North America, and you couldn't watch them on TV if you lived there. The Chicago Wolves, the AHL team across town, were legitimately mocking the Blackhawks in their own marketing materials, running a slogan that said, "We play hockey the old-fashioned way. We actually win." That's where this franchise was. And then the lockout hit. The 2004-5 season was canceled entirely. The Hawks didn't take the ice again until the fall of 2005. The draft that followed the 2003-4 season didn't help much either. The Hawks took Cam Barker 4th overall in 2004 and Jack Skill in 2005. But buried in those dark years were the seeds of everything that was coming. In 2006, they drafted Jonathan Toews. In 2007, Patrick Kane. The worst years were quietly building something extraordinary. The 2022-23 Blackhawks, number 2 on the worst list, brings us into the modern era of pain. The 2022-23 Chicago Blackhawks, 26 wins, last place in the Central Division. The first of what would become multiple consecutive seasons finishing at the bottom of their division. This was a franchise that had deliberately stripped itself down. The dynasty core of Toews, Kane, Keith, Seabrook, Crawford, all of it was being dismantled, piece by piece, to clear the path for a full rebuild. And when you do that, you're supposed to finish last. It's painful, but it's intentional, because finishing last meant finishing first in the race for Connor Bedard, the generational, franchise-altering center from Regina, who had been the consensus number 1 prospect since he was old enough to lace his own skates. Chicago did what they needed to do. They finished last. They got Bedard. The only question left was whether the tank had actually produced the soil needed to grow something special around him. Spoiler, the answer to that question was, at least in the very next season, a resounding no. The 2023-24 Blackhawks, which brings us to the single worst Blackhawks team of the entire 2001 to 2025 era. The 2023-24 Chicago Blackhawks, this team was, and there is genuinely no better way to put it, barely an NHL team for significant stretches of the season. Multiple analysts called the roster outside of Bedard himself closer to an AHL caliber group than a legitimate National Hockey League lineup. And Bedard, to his immense credit, did everything you could possibly ask of a teenager on a team that hopeless. He showed the hockey world that he could actually thrive even while surrounded by nothing. He was electric. He was special. He was everything the organization had hoped for, and then he broke his jaw. A hit took him out for an extended stretch. And when Bedard wasn't on the ice, the Blackhawks had next to nothing. They were losing in ways that were hard to watch. The silver lining, and there was one, was that another terrible season meant another high draft pick. Chicago used it on Artyom Levshunov, a puck-moving defenseman who immediately gave the rebuild its second legitimate pillar. But the broader lesson from these dark years is the most important one. When you rip apart an organization that completely, the rebuild doesn't happen in 2 seasons. It takes time, it takes patience, and it takes a lot of losing before the light starts to appear at the end of the tunnel. Now let's talk about the good stuff, because as brutal as those seasons were to live through, the Blackhawks also produced 3 of the most thrilling, memorable, championship-caliber teams this league has seen in the modern era. And here's the thing worth holding on to. The worst years always came first. The 2014-15 Blackhawks, starting our best list at number 3, the 2014-15 Chicago Blackhawks. Now, ranking the 3 Stanley Cup teams is a genuinely difficult exercise, because all 3 were elite, but one of them has to be third. And by the numbers, specifically their point percentage, which was the lowest of the 3 championship teams, clocking in at 0.622, it's this squad. That said, calling the 2014-15 Hawks the 3rd best team on this list is hardly an insult. This was the team that finished the job the season that completed the dynasty. And they didn't do it easily. The Western Conference Finals against the Anaheim Ducks was one of the most dramatic, hard-fought series of that entire era. The Ducks went up 3-2 inches the series, and the Blackhawks refused to blink, winning Game 6 on the road and then taking a classic Game 7 to advance. Then they dispatched the Tampa Bay Lightning in 6 games in the Stanley Cup Final to claim that 3rd championship in 6 seasons. 3 cups in 6 years. The dictionary definition of a dynasty. And this team got it done with the same core of 2s. Kane, Keith, Seabrook, and Crawford, supplemented now by a rookie named Artemi Panarin, who won the Calder Trophy and immediately announced himself as one of the most exciting players in the league. The 2009-10 Blackhawks. Number 2 on the best list goes to the team that started it all. The 2009-10 Chicago Blackhawks. This is where the dynasty was born, coming out of those dark years in the mid-2000s. The Toes and Kane core had been assembled and was ready to announce itself to the world. And they did. Patrick Kane made sure the Blackhawks ended their 4-9-year championship drought, scoring the cup-winning goal in overtime of Game 6 against the Philadelphia Flyers in what became one of the most iconic moments in franchise history. Here's the detail that makes this team's achievement even more impressive. They did it with Cristobal Hewitt and Antti Niemi in goal. Hewitt and Niemi. When you can win a Stanley Cup with that level of goaltending, the first cup in nearly half a century, it tells you something about just how special the rest of the roster actually was. The forwards were explosive, the blue line was legitimate, and the team had a hunger and a drive that the franchise hadn't felt in a generation. It paved the way for everything that came after it. And in many ways, it's the most emotionally significant championship in this era of Chicago Blackhawks hockey. The 2012-13 Blackhawks, and at number 1, and honestly, it's not particularly close, the 2012-13 Chicago Blackhawks. This team was, in the truest sense of the word, historically dominant. The season was shortened to just 48 games because of a lockout, and the Blackhawks responded by going on a run that no team in the modern NHL has been able to replicate. They opened the season 6-0, then kept winning, then kept earning points. By the time they finally dropped a regulation game, they had gone 2-1-0-3 to start the year at 2-4, game unbeaten streak to open a season that broke the previous NHL record, and stands to this day, their final record, 3-6-7-5, a point percentage of 802. They finished with a plus 5-3 goal differential in just 48 games, scoring 155 goals while allowing an NHL low 102. Crawford and Emery, both posting identical 1.94 goals against averages, won the Jennings Trophy for fewest goals allowed. They won the President's Trophy. They were the clear-cut best team in the league, and then they won the Stanley Cup on top of it. The last team to win both the President's Trophy and the Stanley Cup in the same season. As of right now, no one has done it since. The playoffs were a masterpiece. They beat Minnesota, then rallied from 3-1 down against a Detroit Red Wings team in one of the most memorable comeback series of that entire era. Brent Seabrook's overtime winner in Game 7 is still talked about in Chicago. Then they disposed of the defending champion Los Angeles Kings in 5 games, with Kane scoring a hat trick, including the overtime winner and the clincher. And the final, the Chicago Blackhawks versus the Boston Bruins. 2 Original Six franchises meeting in the Stanley Cup final for the first time since 1979. The Hawks were down 2-1 inch the series, but they kept finding ways. Game 6 inches Boston, down 2-1 with under 2 minutes left. Brian Bickle ties it, and then 17 seconds later, 17 seconds Dave Bolin puts it in the net. The United Center erupted from 2,000 miles away. It might be the greatest 2 minutes in franchise history. Kane won the Conn Smythe as playoff MVP. And that team toes. Kane, Hossa, Keith, Seabrook, Sharp, Saad, Crawford cemented themselves as the greatest Blackhawks team of this era. So, there it is. The 3 worst and 3 best Chicago Blackhawks teams from 2001 to 2025. The 2003-4 squad, buried in mediocrity under an ownership group that alienated its own city. The 2022-23 team, deliberately bad in pursuit of a franchise savior. And the 2023-24 Blackhawks, the one that nearly broke every fan who watched. Balanced against the 2014-15 Dynasty capstone, the 2009-10 Cup drought-ending squad, and the historically dominant 2012-13 team that may never be fully replicated. And here's the thing, the first set of dark years 2003, 2004, 2005 produced Toes and Kane in an era no one in Chicago will ever forget. So maybe, just maybe, this second stretch of darkness, the Bedard years, the Lev Shunov years, whatever comes next is quietly building towards something the hockey world isn't ready for. History has a funny way of repeating itself in the Windy City.